Thank you very much for having me at the branch meeting. It's a pleasure to have been asked and to be with you this afternoon. I thought what I would do is talk through a little bit about what we've done with the Natural Flood Management Programme. Some of you may have heard of it, others haven't. Don't worry, I'll give you a good overview of what the programme was about. I'll talk about the different types of nature-based solutions or natural flood management, and you'll see why I've used both those terms there in a minute through the presentation. We'll talk a bit about what I did to manage the program, and there was a whole team around that, so it wasn't just me. And we'll look at some of the main lessons, the key lessons, things that if you are looking to deliver nature-based solution projects in the future might be of interest to you, and then what we're doing in the future to mainstream those nature-based solutions. Probably before I get into the detail of that, it's probably worth me just mentioning where I am and what I do within the organisation as well. So I work in a newly formed team within the Environment Agency. It used to be called Integrated Outcomes, but we are now the Natural Environment and Rural Resilience team. And we cover a whole range of work as a group of people. We're a bunch of specialists that look at different things. So I've got colleagues that are looking at trying to get flood risk benefits paid for through the Environment Land Management Scheme, which is the replacement to the Common Agricultural Policy. Now we're no longer part of Europe. I've got colleagues who look at maximising environmental outcomes through flood risk projects. So things that some of you may be aware of, the way that flood risk funding works is based on the outcome measures that it delivers. So outcome measure 4, making sure those payment measures, payment rates and the measures are defined well enough so that we can maximise those environmental outcomes. We've got colleagues that look at rural resilience now as well, and what that really means. There are literally hundreds of thousands of properties in the rural environment that are at significant flood risk that just don't stack up for lots of government funding at the moment. So what can we do to try and unlock some of that government funding for them to make those rural communities more resilient, not only to flooding, but also to things like drought, to protect and preserve that rural economy? So that's a bit about me, where I am and what I do. We've also, that's a high level overview of what we've got within the team. We look at things like biodiversity net gain, what the Office of Environment Protection means for flood risk, how we can report on what we've achieved and will achieve as part of the 25-year environment plan, which the government published a few years ago. To really, it sets out an ambition to make the environment better for the next generation to the current generation. And I'm sure there are lots of different ways that that can be badged up, and you'll have heard it in different ways, but that's kind of the briefest I can give you of where I am. So I'd like to just talk briefly before we get into the meat of what the program was and what we've learned from it, about some of the terminology. And already I've started in this presentation almost deliberately to talk about nature-based solutions and natural flood management. But there is a broader term which is used for this type of work, and it's working with natural processes. Working with natural processes is that really broad term that is used for any work that is done to protect, restore and emulate natural processes. And that can be done for kind of any reason. However, the vast majority, the reason that we people do that kind of work is more on the nature-based solutions kind of area within this diagram. And this is a subset of working with natural processes. And they are actions which are really done to address some kind of societal benefit. So they are there for biodiversity, maybe a bit of economics, and they provide those benefits that we humans, society want, but we deliver those through nature-based solutions. And then natural flood management are a subset again of those nature-based solutions, which are driven by a desire to reduce flood risk, or more positively put, to increase flood resilience. So I just thought that it was worth just mentioning those, because we do, and I've seen literature and research that kind of uses those terms interchangeably. Now, I thought what was also interesting at this point is just to mention that these are the terms that we use in the UK, but around the world, colleagues use similar terms or different terms to mean very much the same thing. So our American colleagues, the US Army Corps of Engineers, talk about nature and nature-based solutions, or NNBF, and their handbooks and their work around that is all NNBF. Because they like a three-letter version of these things, they also talk about EWN, which is engineering with nature. And so it's pretty much the same thing. A range of different drivers for it. So for us, it's flood risk that I've been coming at this from, but in America, they use it for coast protection, for maintaining their canals, which are significantly bigger than our canals. They take kind of container ships and such like, and using the power of nature. Around the world, they use water retention measures across Europe, and that can be from flooding, and it can also be, as they use in South Africa, similar techniques to capture water so they can use it for drinking and avoid drought. So these things are being used more around the world for a variety of reasons. But I've come at this from the program, as you'll see in a moment, very much from the flood risk perspective. Just one second. Hopefully you didn't hear that. So before the Natural Flood Management Programme, which started back in, well, we got the money in 2017, we had some projects around the country which looked at working with natural processes. So what I really want to say is that while we talk about natural flood management and nature-based solutions as being new, they're not. We've had them for a while. What we had were a handful of projects across the country that were all special kind of projects. They were special cases to test and trial something. And we had up in the northeast, Belford from Newcastle University using runoff attenuation features, Stroud, which Chris Utley, former colleague of the Environment Agency, back with Stroud Council, Stroud District Council now, where they look to use these because they've got a very young geology in part of their catchment, meaning that hard defences for flood risk management just wouldn't be sustained within the landscape. So they looked at other options. There was the work at Pickering in association with the Forestry Commission, one of the bigger projects that uses a mix of hard and soft engineering, hard being kind of civil engineering, soft being more the nature-based solution end of the spectrum, and Holneycott, a National Trust site that looked to use some of these techniques for flood risk management. But as I say, these were all special projects to see how these things worked. And they were really at a very small scale, very localized area of a catchment. And so when George Osborne gave his last budget as Chancellor, within the announcement for lots of extra money for flood risk, including maintenance and more money for some capital projects, there was £15 million that was, I'm going to say unallocated, but it was allocated to natural flood management. But there was a condition. We, the Environment Agency and DEFRA, had to demonstrate that we could do something with that money to learn from it. And so we went out and we looked across our internal teams and with local authorities to see what projects were out there in the on the list that maybe hadn't had funding in the future that could utilize nature-based solutions. You know, there were many projects where we'd promised a community time and time again we would like to go out and do something for you, and then the way the priority scores worked, it was bumped down the list. So we looked at those communities and thought, well, are they a good option to trial some natural flood management? And could we do it at scale? So we really wanted something that was kind of 100 100 square kilometres or bigger, because most of those catchments that are on the screen there were much, much smaller. And the idea would be that this would give us an increased confidence in being able to use nature-based solutions in the future to reduce flood risk. So from that early prioritization and review of projects that were submitted, and I think we had somewhere in the order of £400 or £500 million worth of projects that could potentially have nature-based solutions as part of their solution. We whittled it down to around 60 projects. And I say around 60 projects because through the course of the programme, we split some projects out from the original 58, and then a few were removed from the programme. And even though there's about 60 dots or stars on that map that you can see, for example, the one of the dots in Cumbria actually has 17 smaller projects beneath it. But I manage that as one kind of project within my program. So it was actually at the very end of 2016 that the government announced the £15 million, and the final allocation to the projects was given in the summer of 2017 after we'd done quite a lot of work to review those bids and to see how well they would stack up and what the opportunities were for learning about nature-based solutions. Now, unlike our big capital program, where we wanted to maximize the number of properties that were protected from the work that we were doing. With the nature-based solutions and natural flood management program, we were really trying to maximize the learning opportunities. So it was trying to see if our top 10 projects all looked at using leaky barriers, for example, did they look at them in different catchments? And if they didn't, then there was no point in having 10 different projects doing broadly the same thing. We would go from 1 to number 11 that maybe looked at offline storage ponds. So we were able to prioritize our program, because it was a learning and research program, slightly differently to how we would prioritize projects in kind of normal times. And to do that, because obviously we're trying to make more use of natural flood management within the toolbox, we made sure that each of the projects tried to deliver on 4 aims. And those 4 aims were to reduce flood and coastal erosion risk, because this was flood and coastal erosion risk money in the first instance. And that was part of the last 6-year capital investment programme. We wanted to improve habitats and increase biodiversity, because we know that we can get those shared benefits from nature-based solutions and natural flood management. And I'll talk more about how we can give some sense of scale to that that range of benefits that we get from these nature-based solution projects later on in the presentation. We wanted to remove some of the research and evidence gaps that we had, contribute to development, and so that there was more confidence around nature-based solutions. Hence, that prioritization that I just mentioned was about which projects will give us the best learning, not just which will deliver the most properties at reduced flood risk or increased flood resilience. And we wanted to make sure that we promoted partnership working. And it was really clear, because at the time, the Minister Powell, was a real champion of this work, and she wanted to, sorry, it was Minister Coffey. She was really keen to make sure that this was embedded and that we got some real learning. And she said on several occasions she didn't mind projects failing, because that was a way of learning from them. Don't get me wrong, we didn't have carte blanche to just go and liberally scatter whatever we wanted within the landscape. We needed to have a good idea that we thought that it would make a difference. But if it didn't make the difference that we hoped or expected it to, then that was fine, because that meant that we wouldn't make that investment in the future. So as I've said, we allocated to 60 projects across the country. What I didn't say was that there is kind of an artificial split within that 60 projects. We had about 25 which were we called them catchment scale projects, and they were led by flood risk management authorities. So organisations, the Environment Agency, local authorities, water companies, and the like, highways authorities as well. And they followed the normal processes for delivering a project, with the exception that within the business case, the justification wasn't necessarily in exactly the same way. It was about the learning that they would give, rather than the number of properties or area of habitats that they thought they would be able to achieve. Because if we were that confident that they would be able to do these things, we wouldn't have needed a test program in the first instance to check that they were able to do that kind of thing. The second part of the projects, around 34, 35 of those projects, we called them community scale projects. Now, these were led by community groups, sometimes through a local authority, but generally it was the community or an environment non-government organisation managing or running these projects. And they were able to bid for up to £50,000 initially for their projects. And as I say, community run. Now, most of those were able to be delivered, but there were 1 or 2, the same as in the catchment scale program, that weren't able to fulfil the final commitment and deliver all of the work that they had hoped to do. And I will give you some case studies later on within the presentation about one of those community scale projects. I think it's also important to note that while the program's been going on, there have been several other projects that have contributed to the learning. So 1 or 2 of those are in the landscape, and they are looking to do natural flood management or nature-based solutions for flood risk. So for example, Leeds The city there has got its first phase of flood defences, flood risk management solutions. Phase 2 is looking at more catchment scale, catchment-based approach, using an awful lot of natural flood management, tree planting and land restoration and such like. So we're learning and we're sharing learning with leads around what nature-based solutions look like in a real live setting rather than just in a pilot program. There's also been some other projects that have gone on around the learning about how we approach nature-based solutions. So not necessarily how do we deliver them, but DEFRA have done a couple of bits of research. They've looked at which methods are available to kind of give you a scale of the benefits from nature-based solutions. And they also did another project which looked at some of the enablers and barriers to nature-based solutions. But critically, they looked at it from the perspective of farmers and landowners rather than from project teams. So that gave us a different perspective. I've also been involved for just over 2 years now in a project which published some information on gov.uk. Now, that project in itself looked at lots of different tools that we might have been able to build to overcome some of the challenges that project teams face and communities face when trying to use these types of solutions. And that helped us to engage with a group of people that I would like to think are practitioners of the future. They're kind of flood novices, and I mean that in a polite way. They don't necessarily understand the risk or where they are, but by being able to engage with them and find out what information they would find useful on gov.uk about that, we got some really valuable insights from them as to how we can help people in the future deliver and make better use of nature-based solutions. So I've talked a lot about the program, about the money. What I haven't done is, for those of you who are maybe less familiar with nature-based solutions, is talk about what some of the measures are. Now, depending on which classification you use, and there's the Working with Natural Processes Evidence Directory, which we published in autumn 2017, and is due for an update by next summer, and I mean summer 23, not summer 22. That classifies the measures into 14 categories, and largely it's the same list as the 11 that you see on the screen here. Now, this graphic is taken from the FCRM strategy, which was published not last summer, the summer before, and kind of what it does is it covers those same 14 measures, but it really kind of combines a lot of the works around woodland and forestry, whereas they're split out in the Working with Natural Processes Evidence Directory. But what I like about this graphic, and what I like to explain about this graphic, is that it shows to me quite clearly that there are measures which are available to communities, to landowners, to towns and cities across our country that are right across the catchment. So right from the source up in the upper reaches, so things like in-stream structures, for example, they're the leaky woody barriers, peatland restoration. So these are things that are outside of main river, which are quite often outside of the role and remit of the Environment Agency. We've looked quite often to waterproof the towns and cities, the receptors of floodwaters, rather than seeing what we can do to hold that water in the landscape higher up. The other thing that I think this graphic shows really, really well is that that middle section is all about the rural environment and agriculture. So there's lots of agricultural practices that we can work at, which is why ELM, the Environment Land Management Scheme, is going to be so important for flood risk management, particularly in those rural areas, but it will have a benefit much further downstream to some of those more vulnerable towns and cities as well. There are measures which are available in towns and cities too, so things like green roofs, sustainable urban drainage, swales. You can, I've seen examples where roads have had roadside parking removed, and planters which filter water before it finds its way into the drains sometime later, because it's held there. It attenuates there for a little longer. So there's things that can be done in the towns and cities as well, and on the coast as well, things like beach recharge, beach renourishment, beach profiling, sand dunes, and salt marsh and such like. So there's plenty of opportunity right the way through our catchments from source to sea that we can do that can really help benefit flood risk or increasing flood resilience, and actually do lots of other wonderful things for the environment, as this graphic shows. So within the Working with Natural Processes evidence directory, each of the 14 measures has a windrows like this. Now, I've just picked the one for river floodplain restoration, just as an example. Now, the scale on there is relative. It's not designed to be an absolute scale, because one of the things that I think is really good about guidance is that it is just guidance. It points you in the right direction, but it gives you as a project manager, as a project team, the flexibility to assess things more specifically for your project and your needs. So in the case of floodplain restoration, we know that we can get multiple benefits from that. The flood is obviously a massive one, the big blue chunk towards the left of the diagram there, but habitats on the right hand side are a real benefit too. Now, if we're really cold about this, flood may just want to pay for the flood benefits, and the habitat is a happy byproduct. But we do know that things like a thriving, healthy floodplain create lots of other natural and wildlife and habitat benefits. So it's really important to think about those. And that can also be really helpful in understanding which partners might want to join a project and where funding might come from, and where land, and if landowners are willing to participate in this project, because this may well help some of their help them achieve some of their ambitions too. You know, there is cultural activity there. There is aesthetic quality on there. So they've been considered as potentially some of the benefits that you can get from these nature-based solutions. Now, if you want to perhaps get improved air quality where you're doing your work, you might not want to think about floodplain restoration if that's one of your primary drivers. But actually, it might be that you could do a couple of different interventions fairly close to each other that would be able to generate that optimum range of benefits, which doesn't necessarily mean the best benefit of any one of these features, but it does mean that overall optimum outcome from your project. And I think it's really important to think about all of these wider benefits, because you know, there are lots of things that we want to see within society at the moment. You know, COP21 last year, 25-year environment plan, strategies, all of those kinds of things, all telling us that they want to see more nature-based solutions. They want us to reach net zero carbon by various dates. I know in the Environment Agency, we've got 2030 as our target. I know 2050 is out there in other places and organizations and such like. So we can start to use this to see how our projects, the solutions that we might look to deliver for our projects, will help to meet those ambitions. And so that's really, really important. And what I haven't mentioned there is the range of, and I kind of alluded to it at the top of the presentation, which is that some of our interventions have a real role when we've got high flows of water, but it's also about protecting our environment when there are low flows. So by being able to hold water within the landscape, helping that to percolate into the ground can help provide clean drinking water and recharge the aquifers that we all rely on. I'm going to bring you a couple of case studies now. So this first one comes from in Sutton schools. Sutton schools are in the London borough of Sutton. Originally, South East Rivers Trust were awarded £50,000 of the Natural Flood Management funding, and you'll remember that that makes them one of the community-led schemes. And they use that to install SUDs in 6 schools in their borough. Actually, they've also looked at trying to do similar methods on some of the other council-owned buildings as well. So such has been the success of this. The measures will reduce flood risk to the schools and, as I say, other properties as well. They're looking at improving water quality, which was another one of their drivers for the River Wandle, which is a chalk stream. They were able to unlock a further £40,000 of additional funding. So they had 90,000 in the end to be able to go and deliver this work. And I think you'll see from the, I mean, I always think the picture bottom left there is just a really pretty picture of what would otherwise be a wall with paved play area right up to the wall. Now there's a planter there, disconnecting the drain pipe and enabling plants to grow. And the picture on the right, I think, is really inspiring as well, because not only have the teachers, staff, and the students been able to get involved, but they have also been able to take this home to their parents. And I've heard lots of statistics recently, not from this project, saying just how influential school pupils are at taking these things home to their parents as well. Just to note with this, they've managed to disconnect somewhere near just over 4 hectares of hard surfaces, such as roads, paths and roofs, from the drainage network as a result of this. And they're seeing that that is helping to reduce surface water flooding and to reduce pollution. So those shared benefits are really very much at the heart of the outcomes that they're looking to deliver there. Moving on to another project. Now, this was in the catchment scale, but is very, very much led by a community group. This is Shipston Area Flood Action Group, Shipston on Stour, which is at the top end of the Cotswolds. It's a market town. It's flooded several times and with quite significant impacts. And they realised that as a community, they weren't ever going to be able to get a huge amount of investment for flood risk management works. So they came together and started to put a plan in action around nature-based solutions. So using their own networks, they worked with farmers and landowners and others to see what could be done in the landscape. As a result, they've managed to deliver over 700 leaky barriers within their landscape. And that's not the only technique they've used. The picture there shows one of the field corner water stores that they've got. So that just collects rainwater, slowly allows it to release back into the river network over a period of time. It also has had the added benefit of it captures soil that's lost and washed away from the field. So at some point, a farmer can go back and take that material out, pop it back on the land, and use that for its for the wider benefit there. Not only have they managed to look after their own town of Shipston, they have also worked far more broadly across the catchment, and they're having a reduction of impact to 17 villages and towns across the catchment, which I think is absolutely fantastic. And that's why this project won an award last year at Flood and Coast Conference, and they won it for their community spirit, which is absolutely brilliant. Now, they've not done it totally on their own. As I said, they've worked with the local authorities, but they've also spent a lot of time working with universities as well to get students out there to help them collect data to manage the project. And they've been really, really keen at sharing the learning that they've got from the work that they have done. So this is a fantastic project to share with you. Now, there are some case studies, talked a little bit about the measures and how the program came about. I just wanted to share with you briefly how I went about managing the program. And there's nothing kind of earth-shattering or groundbreaking in this. It was that I asked the project managers, from the 60 odd projects across the country, to give me monthly updates. And of course, when you're looking after these things, there are some really key things that you want to know are on track. So for example, your finances, milestones. The Minister Coffey was really keen on making sure that we were making progress as quickly as we could. So we had some very set milestones for business cases, work beginning, work finishing, monitoring beginning, those kinds of things. Outcomes, because as you, unlike traditional hard engineered projects, we were looking at making the use of locally won material, and that's not always to the specification that you hope it would be. So by installing these things in a different way, were we absolutely sure that we were able to achieve the outcomes that we had said we would? And so there was lots of toing and froing about making sure that the outcomes that were generated from these projects were as we'd expected them to be. And of course, risk. So quite often risk is seen as kind of a negative, what's the problem? Is there something there? But were there any other things that we could do to unlock at a national scale? So sometimes it was things like landowner agreements, or working nationally with some of the bigger organizations to see if there were some fundamental things that needed on blocking and unlocking at that level. And through that, we managed to help keep the program on track. Now, the program was due to end, and it did officially end at the end of March last year. So literally 11 months ago at the moment. Some of the projects have carried on because COVID was the one thing that I don't think any of us had expected at the start of the program. And while construction was allowed to carry on, and that was very much a government ambition, we were working with some ENGOs, local organisations, small contractors, and some landowners that either stopped their work, didn't want people on their land, furloughed staff. So in those cases, we managed to negotiate a 1-year extension for the NFM funding. And there's a really important point which I haven't highlighted here. The catchment scale projects use the current legislation that we have in the Environment Agency to spend money, which is the Floods and Water Management Act. And there's a further legislation below that in terms of who and how we can pay that money. Essentially, we can give floods granting aid to other risk management authorities or our own contractors. When we wanted to give money to the ENGOs, the community groups, that wasn't covered by the legislation that we had in place. So we had to look at another way of doing that, and eventually came up with the use of the Charities Act. And that in itself is a great solution, but it also brings other complications. So to have money from the Charities Act, you need to provide various reports. You need to make sure that the organisations are there for a benevolent, philanthropic or charitable reason, and make sure that they're set up in the right way. So some of the organisations we were working with had to set themselves up or work with a parish council or work with a local authority to be able to receive that money. And so that was kind of a tricky thing for us to manage through. So on a monthly basis, I took the information that the project teams gave me on finances, milestones, outcomes, and risk, and presented that to a program board. It was a select few, but people that had a vested interest and could help to unlock some of those risks and problems that I mentioned. I took the information from that and provided that, not necessarily monthly, but regularly to the National Portfolio Board that we have, because this money was part of our Capital 6-year programme, and again, took feedback and offered ideas and thoughts to that group about how we can make more use of nature-based solutions. And the Minister Coffey, was really, really keen to have regular updates on this. And I remember in the first couple of years of the programme, there were various reshuffles, elections, etc. And Minister Coffey was reappointed as Floods Minister 2 or 3 times. And on each occasion, within 24 hours, I had an email in my inbox from her private office saying, I would like an update on the Natural Flood Management Programme. And the fact that there was another one that was planned just kind of 2 weeks later didn't seem to matter. It was, no, we kind of want this, and we want this now. So it just shows how keen the minister was to be involved, and presenting some of the changes and some of the updates to the minister in her office was an experience that I won't forget. Now, alongside that, managing the program on a monthly basis and a quarterly basis, and less frequently for ministerial updates, we were trying to get the learning out of the program as well. So I worked with colleagues to develop a monitoring document and a specification. And this isn't about the projects and how well are they performing in terms of their milestones, their finances. This is what learning can we get from the ground side of things. So this is more the measurable stuff on the ground, like flow rates of rivers or water levels in watercourses. So you can try and turn that into flow data. Things like habitat surveys and environmental impact assessments. And because we wanted to make this proportionate for each of the projects, it's not worth telling every project that they need to go out with the gold standard when those that have only got a few tens of thousands are not going to be able to afford the equipment that those that have got a couple of million are. We worked through with basically, I'll describe it as bronze, silver, and gold standard. Bronze being the lowest, which gave some principles of what kinds of things you should look to capture and how regularly. Silver being a bit better than that, and gold being the kind of top-notch standard that we were looking for those projects that had more money to spend. Now, data collection came in a couple of forms. One is that it's that some of the projects are still out on site, and they will be for a few years yet, collecting that data. Some have got things like Raspberry Pi, these small computers, data loggers out in the landscape that they can go and download the data from and put that in. Others have got some remote telemetry, so it's either mobile phone signal or radio signal into somewhere fairly regularly, up to every 15 minutes, which is really frequent data. Other projects at the other end of the scale, they've put a post in the ground with a hashtag carved in it, and they ask people to pop their mobile phone on the top of this and take a picture and upload it to Twitter or wherever using that hashtag so that they can get a sense of what's happening on the ground. Things like fixed point photography has been really, really useful for the projects as well. And as I say, we're still collecting that data, and the project teams will be collecting that data for some time to come. And I mentioned that the program finished a year ago and some projects were given an extension due to COVID. Other projects have managed to secure more money from other sources, partly for their monitoring, but partly to build on what they had already done within the landscape. And they'll continue to develop their project and grow that project organically for years to come. But very much at the heart of that is collecting more data to be able to demonstrate the value and the benefits of the natural flood management techniques that they've installed in the landscape. With that in mind, I think it's worth moving on to show some of the deliverables out of the program. Now, these are the things that have happened in the landscape in terms of, we know that the natural flood management measures have been upstream of 15,000 homes. So can we say that they are at a reduced risk of flooding? Well, we're still doing some of the analysis to see what difference that makes and if it's significant enough and statistically valid enough to be able to claim that. But we know that there's a chance that it will have done that, because that the amount of water that we've looked to store, 1.6 million cubic meters, equates to the everybody's favorite international standard for floodwaters, and it's Olympic swimming pools, and it's 670 Olympic sized swimming pools worth of water. We know that we've improved habitats and planted trees, and they come with huge benefits over a period of time. There's been lots of peatland restoration as well. But for me, the things that I think are really impressive with this, 85 different partners, including government agencies, charities, and a whole host of other people. Now, they're just the ones that had kind of a logo and had acknowledged to be part of partnerships. I know that the projects have not told me about every one of their partners. So that number is a very conservative estimate. I also know that through those partners, we've attracted more than £6 million worth of additional contributions to the program, meaning that 21 million of hard cash, if you like. But that doesn't account for the countless hours that the volunteers have put in installing some of the measures, in monitoring them. I've got loads of projects where some of the community groups still tell me that the moment it starts raining, they put on their waterproofs and they take out their camera and they go and survey and take photos so that they can see what the measures are doing in the landscape. And that's not accounted for in any of the stats that are there, which I just think is a fantastic thing. But more than that, the program for me has been able to teach us how we go about planning our program, who to work with, how to go and find the funding, where to install the measures, how to manage and maintain them. And we certainly haven't answered all of those questions. But I do fundamentally believe, and I'll sit here and tell you this today, that we've got enough information to say that nature-based solutions do make a difference in the landscape, and we should be making more use of them. And I know that we'll need some time to get the statistics to catch up to that statement, but I'm convinced of it. I was just going to check one other thing, make sure that I haven't missed anything in my notes. No, I think that's it from there. So that means that I can move on to talk about some of the main lessons from the Natural Flood Management Programme. And broadly, I think that this is kind of two key elements. I know there's four on the screen, but I will talk about funding specifically in a moment, and finding land, I think, is something that is a key lesson. but is probably something that needs to be looked at on a project by project basis. There's nothing that I can kind of give in a way that's a silver bullet to that. But engagement is a fundamental thing to delivering nature-based solutions, and more technical kind of work that we're looking to do some work on in a moment, which I'll talk about as we mainstream nature-based solutions. But before I get into that, one of the things that has really kind of stuck with me is that we as people are really, really good at finding and worrying about problems and putting obstacles in our own way. I've had lots of projects that have told me that they're really worried about things like synchronized peaks. So what I mean by that is if you've got two tributaries to a river and you slow the water in one, do you then mean that the peak of both of them arrives at the confluence at the same time and make a flood risk problem worse? Now, I've got no examples from the program of where slowing water has actually meant that there's been a bigger problem later on as a result of the measures that have been in the landscape slowing the water. I haven't seen that. I understand as the perceived problem, but I've no evidence from the program, and theoretically it could happen, and it may well happen in the landscape, but I don't think it's a problem that we generally need to worry about too much. So going on to things like engagement. Engagement is fundamental to the delivery of nature-based solutions. You know, I talked about the 85 partners and that being a conservative estimate. None of the projects, whoever delivered them, whoever managed them, whether it was risk management authority or community scale, they all used a combination of environment non-government organisations, community representatives, landowners. Landowners are absolutely fundamental in there, and potentially even some of the contractors. And in some projects, they've had a bit of a hierarchy of who the contractors would be. First and foremost, the landowner, then the landowner's contractor, and then a local contractor. Many of the projects looking to opt for local people to help in the landscape. And there's examples where having those local people that move from one farm or piece of land to another in the local area, they start to learn about what techniques work. And so I've got examples where a digger driver, for example, who was popping in a culvert, automatically dug a bigger pit both sides of the culvert so that water collected in that before it flowed through, and then it would collect in another kind of sump the other side before it would continue its journey, and just did that automatically because he learned that was a good idea. So having those local people can be really, really important to the success of your project, and also having them invested in it and looking after it into the future too. The other thing around engagement is that these projects are generally quite organic. And what I mean by that is that you need to start small and build and build and build. Yes, have that aspiration that the whole catchment and a catchment-based approach is the way to reduce flood risk for your catchment, but recognize that you need to start on a small piece of land and build from there. We know that you get the best outcomes from natural flood management, i.e., the more water retained slowed within the landscape with the higher density of natural flood management techniques, and actually a broad range of natural flood management techniques right across the catchment, not just next to or in the watercourse, are probably better. So I mean things like cross slope woodland, land management, soil aeration, those kinds of things can be really, really important. So recognize that whole suite of things, start small with your partners as well as with the area that you're looking at, and build from there. Technically, some of the lessons that I've learned is that, again, those perceived problems that people have is that it's really hard to model natural flood management and what you might do. And part of that is because the measures use locally one material. Some of it's because we haven't been doing them in modeling terms for a long time, and so it's difficult. We're working at the moment, I'm working with colleagues to do a bit of a literature review, because not all of the measures that we look at need a lot of modeling, or actually we've been modeling them for years. Things like beach management, things like online and offline storage ponds, they have all had the modeling techniques that we use kind of approved, and they're well in use for some of the projects we deliver. Legal agreements is another area, and I'm going to wrap legal agreements, permissions and consents up there isn't one place that you can go to know it. You know, you need this, and this to be able to deliver your project, because the consenting authorities aren't always the same in every part of the country. Different consenting authorities don't always look at doing the consents in the same way. So there are some authorities that look at, they want you to kind of have a consent or a license for every leaky woody structure that you might have through the reach of a catchment, whereas others say, do you know what, they're really low risk, we're happy for you to put 10, 15, you know, this maximum amount of water stored within this area under one consent. In fact, actually, we'll write it for you because it's low risk. So there are real disparities across the country, and I'm not saying there's a right way or a wrong way about this. But these can be quite technical things that project teams need to wrestle with. And the time taken for both engagement and some of these technical things, you know, licenses, permissions, and modeling, I think there's a huge ambition out there for project teams that they can get these things done within a couple of days. And I think the time in those actually pushing buttons and writing things is probably only a couple of days. But like engagement with landowners, it's that work punctuates the time for the landowner or for the consenting authority to think about what you're proposing, make sure it aligns with other plans as well. So quite often these things can take quite a few weeks before you get them back, which can be quite frustrating. So don't be too ambitious is the learning on how quick you can have modeling or agreements and permissions and consents returned to your project. I'm going to talk about funding in a couple of minutes' time, but broadly, the challenge is that lots of projects tell me that it's really difficult to get hold of funding, and if it hadn't have been for the £15 million, they wouldn't have had any funding to seed their projects. The other place of getting funding is private investment contributions, those kinds of things. As I say, I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And I briefly mentioned that finding land is a major challenge for projects. And I think that's partly the engagement with landowners. A lot of landowners are quite concerned about what the move from the Common Agricultural Policy to ELM will mean, and what that will mean for the payments. And if they change the way their land is at the moment, will they be eligible under the ELM scheme in the future? Also, it's quite difficult to know who owns or is responsible for areas of land. And so where can you find that information? Now, land registry is of course the first port of call, and the land registry should be able to help you. If not, local authority or your local network, particularly community groups, having that in with the local farming community, attending some of those kind of agricultural markets and fairs and auctions can put you in the right place to talk to people and get you in the right place. And quite often one farmer or landowner will help you move on to a discussion with another farmer or landowner after that, and try to inspire and build on that organic style project that I've already mentioned. So this is all about the program, what we've learned, what we've done, and as I say, officially closed March last year, but of course we're still learning from the projects and the program. What's next? Well, we are looking to make more use of nature-based solutions. I already mentioned the 25-year environment plan, flood strategy, policy statements. All of these things are driving us to make more use of nature-based solutions, COP21 last year as well. There are actually specific actions, or one specific action in the FCRM strategy, which is all about mainstreaming natural flood management. I'm responsible for it, so it's quite close to my heart. And we've already achieved some of that action by publishing our initial findings from the programme last year. There's a lovely glossy on gov.uk, which I'm happy to share a link with after this call. But we need to look at a few other things in order to be able to make sure that we can make more use of our nature-based solutions. The first is not really mentioned on this slide, actually. There's a very technical one, which is about asset management and recording. So at the moment, the system we have is hosted by Rivers Trust, catchment-based approach, and it's an ArcGIS online system. If that means nothing to you, don't worry. Basically, it's a map that people can click on and pop in the features that they have delivered in the landscape, upload a few photos, any other variables that they've got around that. So how much water does it store? When was it installed? What did it look like before and after? Has it improved hydraulic roughness of that part of the catchment? So there's a few things that can be captured. but are we going to sustain that into the future? Is that the right tool to use? So we will investigate that. We'll keep it working until we've got an idea, and it may well be that we continue to use that. But I know there are other organizations that want to make more use of understanding what nature-based solutions are in the landscape. I think it's really important we have something that's open and visible, so that something that's done for nature-based solutions, whether or not it's for flood risk or just those kind of broader working with natural processes measures, that they're visible so that nobody comes along and rips them out in the future for some other reason that they didn't really understand why they were there first. So that leads me on to kind of two broad areas, apart from that kind of very technical one that I mentioned. Awareness raising. So I think we need to share more of the information about nature-based solutions with more groups. We need to demonstrate that it works. As I say, I've got some anecdotal evidence. I've got some numbers coming through that are statistically valid, but not as many as I'd like, to show that it does work. And I'm really confident in that. We need to make sure that other flood projects that we're looking to deliver in the future, hard engineered projects, consider nature-based solutions as part of their solution, even if they don't end up coming to much. But actually, I would see that a hard engineered project around a town or a city or a small rural community could look at doing something, working with a farmer through the Environment Land Management Scheme. The catchment sensitive farming officers might be able to give the right advice to say, this is what you could do in your land, and that will make a difference. And that means that that hard engineered structure might not need to be built quite so big or so high or so wide, and it might last a bit longer because it doesn't have lots of floodwater brushing up against it or washing up against it as regularly as it might have done. And recognize climate change is going to mean that our defences are tested more and more often. The other thing is we're doing quite a lot of work in that space of raising awareness at the moment. I mentioned the US Army Corps of Engineers earlier. They've just published, well, at the end of last year, their Engineering with Nature handbook, or NNBF handbook. There's also a couple of atlases that talk about engineering with nature. They use examples from around the world. Many of them are from the UK, I'm really pleased to say. And I think that that's a really great document to share and promote what we're doing with nature-based solutions. It's available on the internet, and it's a free to download thing as well. And I really recommend you get a copy of it and share that with people as well, because it does inspire people. The other thing we need to do is capacity building. So this is more than just raising awareness, but this is amending some of our processes, giving people tools, funding rules, providing training. I mentioned modeling earlier and looking at what we can do. So we know that we've got modeling standards for things like ponds and online and offline ponds. What can we do to get the right tools in the right place so that people can use nature-based solutions confidently? I just thought that the photo on the right-hand side of this slide is taken from Evenlode, which is Upper Thames catchment in the Cotswolds, and the four kind of ponds or field things in the kind of the mid section of that, it's almost diamond shaped. They were originally built because Little Stockbrook wasn't doing so well with WFD, Water Framework Directive. So the project originally started to stop some of the soil running off the field straight into the Thames catchment and polluting the watercourses. So they built these ponds to trap silt and sediment. And actually, the shared benefit of that not being a flood-driven project meant that flood money was able to be secured and put towards it, because these ponds also store floodwaters. And I think that's a really great story, that this project has been able to deliver those multiple benefits. And we often think that flood is the part of the organization or the benefit that we're trying to secure. And actually, other times flood can be the byproduct of another project that's being delivered. And so I just wanted to share that with you there. I've mentioned funding, and this is a challenge and a barrier for some of our projects, but I think there is hope. I talked already about the fact that we've got a 6-year program. I didn't tell you that it's £5.2 billion for the current 6-year program. And we're hoping that we can get more nature-based solutions in there. Well, actually, DEFRA have got a policy statement that says we will double the number of nature-based solutions in this program compared to the last. so there is a real driver to do that. But flood risk funding, FCRM grant in aid, GIA, has some very specific rules about it. It pays for certain outcomes at a certain rate, and so for me to unlock that, you really need to know what it is that you're trying to deliver out of your project and what flood benefits, eligible flood benefits, could be paid for through grant in aid. So going back to the idea of partnership, and you think, why are you talking partnership when we're talking funding, John? If you get the right group of partners around to come up with a shared vision for their project, to understand what benefits they're looking at delivering, you can start to understand which funding sources may be available to you. And I'm not saying that they've all got funding to give to you and your project, but you can start having those conversations and see if there are opportunities. And you don't necessarily need all of the funding that you want. Remember, I said these are kind of organic type projects compared to hard engineering. So you need to have the an amount of funding to be able to start your project initially and build on that over time. As you gather momentum, you will find that the funding comes with it as well. That's certainly the experience that I've found from the program as well. And because there are that wide range of benefits that you can deliver, there are a wide range of sources, almost limitless sources in terms of where money might come from. So that's the FCRM GIA based on the outcomes that it will deliver. Generally, I think you will be looking at more of the environmental kind of the outcome measure specifically for those of you who know about outcome measures specifically. The Environment Land Management Scheme, this is the replacement to the Common Agricultural Policy and looks to pay farmers and landowners based on the public good they deliver. It's actually in three parts: sustainable farming incentive, nature recovery, and landscape recovery. And I think that there will be opportunities not only for the upfront work to deliver and implement some of these measures, but hopefully some of the maintenance, the longer term maintenance of nature-based solutions in the future. Then we can move on to some of the other government funds that have been announced. So Nature for Climate, there's a huge drive at the moment to deliver more trees. The England Woodland Creation offer work around peatland restoration, which has multiple benefits: storing and slowing water, wetter peatland, more healthy peatland absorbs carbon and is less likely to catch fire as well. So we'll have fewer of those wildfires, which then release carbon into the atmosphere. So there's those funds that might have some opportunity to help reduce flood risk or deliver nature-based solutions. And in addition to that, we're really looking at some kind of benefactor, if I'm honest. So, I was at a debate last week, actually the week before, talking about how there might be availability of investment from private investors. And I think we've always looked at trying to be able to give some kind of financial return to investors, because that's how corporate rules are set out, to benefit essentially shareholders of businesses. But actually, if we can start to say that one of the outcomes that they want to see is a better environment, more sustainable materials they use, those kinds of things, then actually that could be one of the outcomes in the future. And there are examples around the world at the moment where farmers that want to change from one type and form of farming to another, an investor will pay for that transition. And they get their return basically by a levy on profits over a baseline before the farm transitioned. And therefore, if the farm doesn't make any more money, the investor won't get a return on their funding. They're kind of buying something rather than trying to get the interest on the loan is probably the way that I could describe it most simply. So yeah, so there, money really comes from the government through taxation, investment from companies, or goodwill, so donations and very kind benefactors. The point I think I really do need to make at this moment is that most of our projects that look to achieve nature-based solutions or the outcomes that nature-based solutions provide will use a mix of those funding sources. I don't think you'll see one source only for these projects. So more or less brings me to the end of the presentation. Where I think that I'd sum up for here is that I think we've all got a role to play with nature-based solutions. You think back to Sutton schools as the case study I shared with you earlier. You know, some of those things we might be able to do to our own home. Now, I recognize that not everybody owns their own property or has the ability to do some of the similar kind of work on their own property. But that doesn't mean to say that you can't help with that in your village or your town. Because the water that is slowed and stored in your area is not going to go downstream so quickly and cause flooding to someone else. And you wouldn't want those upstream of you to push their water down more quickly to your doorstep. So for me, things that you can look at home: don't pave your drives necessarily, disconnect the gutters and drains, use water butts, all the things that you know about already. For me, I think also bigger schemes need more input from a range of stakeholders. We need to see more true partnerships. Talked about partnerships being really important to what we try and do with natural flood management. No project succeeds without the use of partnerships. NFM complements hard engineering. There are standalone nature-based solution schemes. Quite often they're upstream of somewhere that's got a hard engineered scheme, so they've just been built at different times. But we can look to make more use of nature-based solutions in an integrated way with hard engineering. Nature-based solutions are quite cost-effective. I've got some figures on that, but they do need some heavy caveats. What I would say is that they make the biggest difference where there is the highest density of them and a range of solutions. And projects are best done across a whole catchment. Don't try and achieve everything across your catchment in one go. I think it's really important to start small and grow from there. Nature-based solutions don't have to have a defined start and end point. You can kind of keep going and adding to them for as long as you want, really. It's not like a brick wall that the brick wall's finished when the last brick is installed. So you can do more with these things, which I think is absolutely fantastic and inspiring, and actually really helps communities to come together, because you can generate that momentum, you can attract funding, you can inspire people to come with you, and over years you can, as the Shipston project demonstrates, you can achieve some fantastic outcomes, not just for flood, but for a range of other benefits too. And with that, I will leave some contact details on the screen for you for a moment. And I'm guessing that there will be some questions which I haven't been able to keep my eye on while I've been talking. And I'm hoping either Jonathan or Barbara will be able to support.
Yes, you've got more than 14 questions now. So I think the best thing is to dive in, although some of the answers you may have touched on in your slides to do with main lessons and mainstreaming of this. But anyway, let's crack on. First one is about carbon capture. What measures are in place to make sure a project doesn't double count the carbon reduction by building one, and to include carbon capture from the atmosphere? So it's about your carbon balance calculation, really. How confident are you about that? Oh, you're on mute, John.
Sorry, I managed to mute myself on two buttons, one on the screen and one on the handset. I didn't know that was possible. When the program started, we weren't in the place that we are now with net zero and carbon calculators and such like. So the projects in the program didn't necessarily have a kind of a full assessment on carbon and such like. There are various tools that are out there at the moment that can be used, and I would advocate in the future for that. But there's not been so much there, and I think it's a great question. It's something that I probably need to take away and think about for the future. But I do know that with flood risk granting aid investment, we are looking at seeing that carbon calculator with all projects that come in that look at that whole kind of life cycle of the asset that's being looked at being built.
Okay, next question. It also asks about carbon capture, but I think the first part is some NFM measures have a shorter life than hard engineering options. I'm not sure that's necessarily true, but oh, I see. Has there been any assessment of carbon impact over the life cycle of the project? So that really goes with the first question. whether it's a short or long-term project. Oh, you're muting again, John.
I really don't know why this is doing two at a
Yes,
time.
it seems when I speak, it goes.
Yeah, no,
Be
it doesn't
quiet.
matter. I'll remember that next time. I won't. I'll build on what I said before in terms of there's some extra work there for the future, and we're already doing that carbon capture. In terms of the life cycle or the life expectancy of some of the measures, I think it's really easy to look at a leaky barrier and think that's made of some wood that's been locally won from trees around it. You know, we've chainsawed some branches off, or a whole tree has come down over a period of time. That is going to rot, deteriorate. Parts of it are going to wash downstream, and so you might say that that's got a relatively short life cycle. Now, if that's in the right place in a wood, there is, and this is one of the things we want to test in the fullness of time. Do other trees fall around it at some point and regenerate barriers, maybe in different places? But you know, are we looking at that one barrier, or are we looking at the system of leaky barriers within a reach of a river? I think interestingly on the carbon thing, um, trees. So they have when we plant saplings, they have an instant benefit in the landscape, the research tells us, because we've disturbed the ground. You increase the hydraulic roughness where you've dug a hole, put the tree in, and put the earth back on it, and their root network is starting to expand. Because they're saplings, they're not really taking an awful lot of water out of the ground at that point. And so it can take, depending on the species of tree, 5, 10, 15, 25 years before you're starting to see lots of those benefits and where they start to capture more and more carbon and those kinds of things. So what I said to the projects up front was, don't try and be too ambitious and overestimate how long you think that these things will last in the landscape. I'd also pick some other measures. If we're reconnecting floodplain or renaturalizing a channel, how long will that last? For me, that's more forever. We've basically helped nature get back on track with something that generally our forefathers had taken out of a natural state. And so as a result, I think that there probably isn't too much maintenance and almost an infinite life to that, rather than a shorter life cycle. So I hope that helps, that all of the interventions are different in terms of their life cycle.
I've got a couple of questions about maintenance. Joanne's asking, have any considerations about maintenance and management longevity of measures started to come out? And is there ongoing work to assess maintenance, continuing benefits, any degradation in effectiveness of the schemes? It's about maintenance of these schemes
Yeah,
and
there's a couple of good
longevity.
a couple of points there. So again, building on what I just said, different measures, different kind of regimes and such like in terms of the maintenance. It's one of the things that we are looking at with the projects. So some of the project teams had said we will work with the landowner, and if things look like they're not working so well, we'll take them out within the first year or two, no problem, and we'll make sure that there's nothing that's going to cause any damage to your land or whatever. I haven't heard of any of them being taken out at the moment. That doesn't mean to say they haven't been, but I haven't heard of any that have been removed as a result. I think when we talk maintenance, most people see the maintenance being linked more to the leaky barrier end, or things like the planters that I showed in Sutton schools. Now the planters, I think, because they are built by companies, have an estimated design life and a maintenance that you can kind of download with the instruction manual when you install them. Leaky barriers are the ones that I think people are most nervous of, and probably the first nature-based solution natural flood management measure that people visualize and they can understand how they would deteriorate, how they will possibly cause problems, block culverts, get in places we don't want them. So I'm very careful not to call them debris dams, as some people call them, because debris is the stuff we fish out of rivers just before a flood, and they're carefully placed material for a job. But there are things that we can do to minimize that. So some of them have been pinned in place with rebar. Some of them have been put just upstream of trees and other fixed features, so they're not going to break away. And we're monitoring them to see how long they will last in the landscape. But of course, if you use things like willow, willow will grow. So you've got a living defense there rather than something that needs necessarily an awful lot of maintenance. So trying to minimize that maintenance as far as possible.
Okay, the next question is a good one, but I'll just take the first half of it because of shortage of time. Jenny says, I'm interested to hear how you think benefits of a larger scale proposed. And when somebody writes another question, my screen jumps. Monetize, particularly where schemes may take time to bed in before the true benefits are realized. So it's about what these are going to be like to scale up and how you're going to monetize, how you're going to cost that.
So yeah, no, so I think there's probably a couple of ways that we could answer that question and look at it. So the first is just monetizing the benefits, because generally we're saying that the benefits are damage avoided in lots of cases. That's not the only benefits that they generate, and I think if we look at this in purely financial terms, that's not necessarily the right way to look at what we can do with nature-based solutions and with them. So I think this is about understanding and identifying the range of benefits that the measures can deliver, and talking about different types of capital. So financial capital obviously being one of them, but I think natural capital, I think social capital, I think health and well-being kind of capitals are really important there, so that we're not just monetizing the benefits that we're always used to monetizing. We do recognize that these projects deliver other things on top, and that they have a value even if it's difficult to monetize it. But they're things that we want as society. They're the things that, you know, we all know are the right things to do in the face of climate change. I think there's a little more to that question, but I'm hoping that I answered most of it, but maybe not.
So many coming in. I think
yeah.
there are comments and questions about people's getting the public motivated and their own enthusiasm. I mean, are our members able to contact you, John, or how can they ask more or express an interest in this?
Depending on how many we get and how I'm not going to be able to commit to getting back to everybody by the end of the week.
There are hundreds listening,
but I will do my utmost to get back to questions. So khub.net, which is on the screen at the moment, is a free knowledge hub site, and that catchment scale natural flood management projects group was I set it up for the NFM program itself, and since the program has come to an end, opening it up more widely. Now there are lots of things on there. It's not all controlled content, so projects can ask questions of each other with a forum. They can upload documents. So that might be a landowner agreement that worked for them, which absolutely wouldn't work for somebody else, but there's some ideas on there. There's also links to some of the tools I mentioned for assessing benefits. So Arup created an Excel-based spreadsheet a few years ago, and there's a webinar, and the tool is on there available to use and such like. So that might answer some of those broader questions, but I'm also happy to take other questions through either my own email address or nfm-environment-agency.gov.uk.
Okay, using the chairman's prerogative, there's an interesting question here about risk. From a project management perspective, what are some of the risks to project completion, and by extension risks to consider when undertaking future NBS projects? So what's about the risk of, dare I say, failing, or some of the hurdles you have to get over to make sure that it works?
So this goes back to what I was saying earlier about I've learned a lot about human behavior and their perception of risk, and I think it's really, really easy for us to start by kind of thinking about all the things that could go wrong, and actually I think we need to look at this, and we need to start from a position where we truly believe that nature-based solutions are going to do something great in our landscape. They're in the right place, they're doing the right thing, and for me, I think that helps to kind of minimize some of that risk that's being asked about there. The risk of not completion is really interesting, because as I was trying to say through the program, through the presentation, yes, have that big ambition that you're going to liberally scatter nature-based solutions across your catchment. You're going to work with landowners. They're going to make their soil more aerated. They're going to install leaky barriers. There's going to be buffer strips. There's going to be hedgerows. It's going to deliver this wonderful landscape. That's your vision, but don't try and deliver that all on day one. Start with a couple of small fields, maybe in the lower catchment, maybe in the upper catchment, wherever you've got that opportunity, and build to it. So that risk of failure, I think, is related to the ambition of your project, and maybe break your project into phases. And one of the things that I want to do with in terms of assurance for the government funding side of things is to say, maybe what we do is we look to approve in principle a certain amount of money for these projects, but actually draw it down in smaller phases so that you don't have that kind of, you're not trying to deliver something that's so massive first off that you're just setting yourself up to fail. You're going to try and eat the elephant in smaller bites in a way, and I think that will help to minimize that risk. The other risks about maintenance: ask the right questions of people with the land where it's going to go on, where they're happy to have the interventions. Are they happy to look after them in the future? Depending on what they are, how much looking after are they really going to need? Also think about where the money's coming from, who's involved with these sorts of things. So I would say you're never going to eliminate all the risk of any project, but what you can do is ask yourself a set of questions and be comfortable enough that you've got the right mindset to be able to overcome those elements of risk.
My screen is jumping around. There's so many people asking questions. But there was a question about whether you should take the N off the NFM label, take the natural out, and shouldn't be flood management be the go-to word. But I guess hard engineering projects are always going to be part of the appraisal.
So I naively thought 5 years ago when I embarked on this program that the ambition would be that at the end of it, we wouldn't talk about natural flood management and hard engineering. We would just talk about flood risk management, because actually these are in the same toolbox as hard defences, as maintenance, as mapping for understanding where risk is, as flood warning and flood forecasting. You know, all of that comes together, that mosaic, that jigsaw of different things that we can do to reduce flood risk. At the moment, we're not in a place where some of the communities, some of our partners, others have confidence in the natural element and they don't believe it will work. So I think, yes, we want to get to a place where we just talk about flood risk management measures and nature-based solutions, resilience measures, whatever are part of it, but we're not quite there yet.
I just want to go to a recent question at the end. The big message that came from your talk was that flood risk was only one of the many beneficiaries of NBS, whilst at present funding streams tend to be focused on specific issues. Do you see any evidence of funding streams or mechanisms becoming integrated, ideally funding streams that recognize and value multiple benefits? Even a shift this way would be good.
Yes, and I think that the trailblazer for this at the moment is the Environment Land Management Scheme. And I know that there's pilots going on, and I know that it's not all defined at the moment, but for me, that is looking at trying to provide funding for the landowner community, and primarily, you know, there are lots of other landowners out there, but primarily, you know, we're talking about farmers here, where we will incentivize them to make changes or to do things within the landscape that have multiple benefits. So soil aeration will not only help better soil health, carbon storage, those kinds of things. It will help more water infiltrate, which helps reduce flooding. Buffer strips, again, will bring about more wildlife, tree planting, more wildlife, more biodiversity, increase hydraulic roughness, and slow the flow for flood risk purposes too. So yes, we're seeing that. Are we there yet? Are there lots of other things probably we could do more in the future? But I think to acknowledge that there are all of these range of government funds that are coming through, that do those, that may have their own individual focus, but can be used together. For example, England Woodland Creation Offer can be used alongside granting aid for flood risk to plant trees when you're doing your flood works. I think that shows that there is more of that integrated thinking going on, but there is more to do as well.
Going back, there's quite a long statement, an interesting part by Brian Reed, but at the end of it, he's talking about his past experience in this, and he said jargon was a problem. Experts had problems in explaining to mere mortals. So are you finding when you're talking to farmers and people not in the water sector that jargon is a problem?
Definitely, and that was one of the things I talked about with the page that's published on gov.uk. And one of the things that community groups, flood novices, future practitioners struggled with was the jargon and what we talk about. So I already, I tried to influence people on the call today not to talk about debris dams. The reality is that I do know that for community groups, they grasp what that is quicker than talking about a leaky barrier. One of the other reasons that I try and use the word or the phrase leaky barrier is that in Cumbria, they don't just make them out of wood. They use some of the big bits of stone that have washed down the mountains as well. So for me, a leaky barrier can be any material, but forms the same purpose. But actually for a community, a debris dam probably makes more sense to them in the initial stages, and it gets over that jargon thing that's being mentioned there. So yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the reasons why when we established the community program, and we cut more slack to those groups when it came to things like business cases, recognizing that they didn't have access to our maps that risk management authorities have. They didn't understand the jargon. They understood the principles, and they lived in the community, and they knew the places that got wet and were wet most of the year and could store water. So we tried to work with them to find out how we could get that information and knowledge from them to achieve great things.
Well, John, on behalf of the members, I'd really like to thank you for a tremendous presentation. And all our members probably have to get off and do other things now, but there's lots of references there for them to pick up on future events from CIWEM and all the good work that you're doing, John, on this. Barbara, if that's it, I think we'll wrap up now.
Yes, I think I'd just like to thank John for a really interesting talk, and also for the West Midlands branch for organising this. As I say, keep a look on the events page for future events, and also recordings as well, our podcast recordings. I put the link in the chat, so if you want to have a look at some of the past recordings.
Okay.
And I'd like to say thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure this afternoon.
Okay. I wish everybody a good rest of the day.